In the history of organized crime, there is one name that haunts the FBI to this day. A man who built an empire and then vanished into thin air. Frank Matthews was born in Durham, North Carolina, but he knew early on that his ambition was too big for a small town. He wanted the world. He arrived in Harlem in the 1960s. At the time, the streets were controlled by the Italian Mafia. They owned the numbers. They owned the drugs. For decades, if you wanted to do business, you paid the tax. The five families took their cut of everything. But Frank saw a weakness. Why pay the middleman? Frank realized that if he could establish his own pipeline, he wouldn't just be a player, he'd be the king. And so, the rise of Black Caesar began. But with absolute power comes absolute danger. By 1971, the money wasn't just rolling in, it was flooding in. Frank wasn't just a boss anymore. He was an institution. His organization spanned 21 states. He was moving more product than the Italian Mafia, and he was doing it independently. In October 1971, Frank called a meeting in Atlanta. The top black kingpins from across America. The goal? To unite and push the Mafia out completely. But they weren't the only ones watching. The DEA and the NYPD had set up a task force, and they were terrified. Frank Matthews had become the #1 target. They knew they had to take him down, but Frank was always one step ahead. In January 1973, the law finally caught up with Frank Matthews. He was arrested in Las Vegas and brought back to New York. The bail was set at $325,000, the highest in New York history. The feds thought it was impossible. Frank paid it in cash. On July 2nd, 1973, Frank was scheduled for a hearing. He never showed up. He took millions in cash, his girlfriend, and vanished. The FBI launched a global manhunt. They looked in Venezuela, the Bahamas, Africa, but Frank Matthews had become a ghost. Did he die? Is he living like a king in another country? To this day, the case remains open. The mystery of Black Caesar is unsolved. To understand the kingpin, you have to understand the boy. Frank wasn't born into royalty. He was born into the dust and segregation of Durham, North Carolina, 1944. His criminal career didn't start with heroin. It started with chickens. At age 9, Frank was already organizing raids on local coups. He was a born leader. But Durham was too small. He would sit by the tracks for hours, watching the trains head north. He knew that somewhere down that line was a throne waiting for him. So he left. He took that ambition, that hunger, and he brought it to the streets of Philadelphia, and finally, New York. Before the state lottery, there was the numbers game. For the people of Harlem, it was the only banking system they had, a way to dream big for pennies. It started with the runner. He was the face of the operation. He collected the bets, nickel, dime, a quarter from the neighborhood. Everyone knew him. You picked 3 numbers. If your number hit, the payout was 600 to 1. A 10-cent bet could win you $60. That was a week's wages. The runners brought the slips to the controller, and the controller brought the money to the bank. It was a multi-million-dollar machine running on paper. Frank understood that this wasn't just gambling. It was logistics, and he ran it with the precision of a Fortune 500 CEO. The numbers game made Frank rich, but he didn't want to be rich. He wanted to be wealthy. And in 1965, there was only one commodity that offered that kind of scale. Frank did the unthinkable. He flew to Caracas and met with Rolando Gonzalez. He cut out the 5 families and bought directly from the source. While the mob was fighting over the French Connection in Marseille, Frank was building a pipeline right through the Caribbean. Faster, cheaper, and purer. When Frank's product hit the streets, the competition crumbled. The mob couldn't compete on price, and they definitely couldn't compete on quality. Overnight, Frank went from a neighborhood banker to an international drug lord. And the Italian families, they never saw it coming. Most kingpins lived in the shadows. Frank lived in a palace. He bought the Buttonwood Manor on Staten Island, a symbol that he had arrived. His neighbors didn't know what to make of him. A black businessman with endless cash, throwing parties that lasted all weekend. And then there was the style. Mink coats, leather suits, diamond rings. Frank Matthews didn't just have money, he had swagger. But back in Harlem, he was a hero. He paid for rents, he bought turkeys for Thanksgiving. To the feds, he was a monster. To Harlem, he was Robin Hood.